Well, good evening, and thank you. My God, there's actually people here. This is quite extraordinary, and I don't actually know all of them, which is even better. Thank you all for coming. I want to thank, just to start with a few thanks to all the folks here at Town Hall who's made this so easy and fun to do. Wherever you are, Laurie Dugdale from the iSchool Communications Office and Peter Kelly from UW News Services, both of whom have been real fans and supporters of this, of the whole series, and thank you all for coming. For many of us, our thoughts are with a couple of friends and colleagues who aren't with us tonight. So Harry and Cheryl, wherever you are, however you're listening, we know you should be here, we know you want to be here, and next time you will be. So what am I going to do tonight? I'm going to tell you some stories, because that's kind of what I do. Some you know and some you don't. Why the date of Thanksgiving is related to the founding of Canada. What barcodes have to do with the Protestant Reformation, and what Richard Nixon's secretary has in common with the British settlers of New Zealand. So take notes, there'll be a quiz at the end. So, documents that changed the world. I should begin by establishing my credentials. I know about documents. I know so much about them that I live my life surrounded by them, as some people in the room will testify. This is my office this morning. You can tell because the presentation is on the screen in the corner. I thought that was about as meta as I could get. There's the banana I had for breakfast this morning. So yes, I know about documents. I know about documents for a bunch of different reasons, not only because I live with them, but because I've been a librarian, as you heard, for my entire life. So what's a document? That's a good place to start. Well, that is, yes, thanks to Terry, too, wherever he is, because without him, none of this ever actually really happens. This was us at the Olympics. This is a document.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
An oral document, A-U-R-A-L, that sent several thousand people, or so we're told, into the streets of New York and New Jersey, believing that Martians had landed in the Jersey marshlands, which many bizarre things have happened in the New Jersey marshlands, but so far as we know, not that. And this is a document, so we might as well start at the beginning. This is the first document most of us ever have. As you can see, it's a copy of mine. I should probably know where the original is, but I don't. This is a copy of mine. So I want to talk for a while about what documents do, what kind of roles they serve, what kind of purposes they serve, what they do for us. So what do documents do? They document. Thank you all for coming. You've been a great audience. Questions? They record milestones and markers of all kinds of human activity, good, bad, and indifferent. What they record and how, and what they don't record can make a difference. Small in some cases, large in others. Other people's birth certificates have had more notice and attention over the last year or two or more. Some of these effects have been profound and some quite intimate, and I want to talk about all of those tonight. And I want to start with documents that are intended to record or to mark or to memorialize. The AIDS quilt, the NAMES Project AIDS Memorial Quilt, started in 1987 by accident at a march through the streets of San Francisco to memorialize people who had died of AIDS. People in the march held placards, and at the end of the march, people stuck those placards on the wall. And it looked like a quilt, and hence the idea is born. To the extent now there are so many panels that it will never again be intact. It's too large to ever be fully assembled. Not to mention it could be assembled in any order and still be equally valid. Not to mention there are enormous preservation and conservation concerns about this. It's moved all the time, it's exposed to the elements in bits and pieces, not all intact. It's exposed to the elements. It's made of every material you can imagine. And given the people who have made these, you can imagine some of those materials. I'll stop at sequins and bowling balls and feathers and jockstraps, and you can go from there. It's quite an extraordinary example of something that had one set of intentions and then grew to take on others. The Bayeux tapestry, we believe woven in the 1070s, but it is not at all clear who did it, when it was done, why it was done, or where it was for several hundred years. It materializes in the 14th or 15th centuries, and it wasn't made in Bayeux, and it has nothing really to do with Bayeux. It's the Battle of Hastings, which was 1066, so it seems to be something shortly after that, but nobody quite knows what it was for. We'll come back to the Bayeux tapestry in a bit. And then, this is where it all kind of started for this series. Where is Andy? I told him I was going to embarrass him in public. Andy Brink, who recently graduated from our program, and I worked together on a research project that kicked off this series. The main point here is wash your hands. If you get a chance to decide how you want to die, cholera is not what you want to pick. We spent several weeks researching the John Snow's cholera map, which you've heard about big data. This is big data in 1854. People were dying of cholera in their hundreds and thousands in London, and nobody knew why. The prevailing theory at the time was the miasma theory, that disease was caused by bad smell. And there was a lot of bad smell to be had in London in 1854, don't get me wrong, but that wasn't what was doing it. But you have to get people over the idea that is what causes it. So John Snow, just a physician in London at the time, puts together several pieces of data, puts together statistical data, puts together anecdotal data from people walking around the neighborhood, puts together questions he asks people about where you get your water. And the bottom line here is, if you turned left to get water from a contaminated pump, you died. And if you turned right to get your water from a clean pump, you lived. John Snow figured that out. He was able to consolidate many different kinds of data into a really easy and actually quite beautiful map that answered the question about where cholera came from and how it was transmitted. Begins epidemiology, begins public health, largely begins what we would today think of as geographic information systems, all by drawing these little dots on the map by hand. The most interesting thing from our perspective when Andy and I were doing this was, where is the map? It's the sort of thing that people in the library and archival business and museum business are really interested in. Where is the map? Nobody else seems to care. There's an entire book written about this called The Ghost Map. Great book. A little too lurid in spots, but a great book. Makes absolutely no mention of where the map is. The John Snow Society in London has no idea and doesn't care where the map is. So it's not, and this is a case where it isn't the map itself, it's what the map did and what it started and what it solved. Does anybody know what the human creation that has gone the furthest is? It's Voyager. And on Voyager is the golden record, sometimes called the golden disc. This was created in the middle 70s to, if somebody ever finds Voyager, and if you've seen the first Star Trek movie, we know the answer to that. We can hope for a better outcome than the first Star Trek movie. You could hope for a better movie than the first Star Trek movie. There is a gold-plated record album, record album, that includes instructions on how to build a player to play the golden record, because it's not like, aliens have hi-fi with 33 1/3 RPMs. It also tries to say where the solar system is, and on the other side there are pictures of engravings of a man and a woman. This is meant to document the entire human species through about 20 pieces of music. Mostly Western classical music, which is a little disappointing, but Johnny Be Good, Chuck Berry is on there too, so at least there's hope. Some documents are meant to declare or proclaim. Intergravissimus, this was the other one that Andy and I did the first, as we just began doing these. Intergravissimus is the papal bull, B-U-L-L, papal edict that established the Gregorian calendar. The calendar was way out of whack. Easter was being celebrated earlier and earlier because the sun and the moon don't line up calendrically speaking, which is why the Jewish calendar, Jewish holidays float through the year, why the Islamic calendar always floats through the year. Ramadan comes at a different point in the year every year. And so if you follow a lunar calendar, you get one way of reckoning the year, and that's months. You go by the sun, you get years, and they don't work. So somebody had to fix it, and in 1582, the only person who could fix it is the Pope. So the Pope signs a document. There was a commission, there was a comment period. It was almost like Seattle. There was a comment period, people sent comments, and then the Pope just signs it. You see the guy pointing there, he's pointing to the zodiac to try to line it all up properly. The Pope said, and only the Pope, and not much later after this, the Pope would not have been in a position. As it was, this took centuries for the Gregorian calendar to make its way throughout Europe, because this is also the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, not to mention the rest of the world, not to mention there are still large chunks of the world that do not use the Gregorian calendar. Other proclamations and declarations, the date of Thanksgiving, Franklin Roosevelt tried to move the date of Thanksgiving by presidential proclamation a week earlier in the 30s to encourage Christmas shopping, and took a lot of crap for it. If you've ever seen Holiday Inn, the movie Holiday Inn, you know at the end there's Thanksgiving and the turkey goes back and forth between 2 weeks in November for Thanksgiving. That's what that's all about, is that they kept changing their minds about the date of Thanksgiving. But the date of Thanksgiving is by presidential proclamation. The founding of Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company that ruled Canada, a company that ruled Canada for centuries, that was by royal charter. That's the King of England saying, you get it all. Do whatever you want. And the King of England gets to do that because there was kind of nobody else to do it. Some documents codify or organize or structure. Sequoia's syllabary. So Sequoia, who creates, it's not an alphabet, it's a syllabary. And you see his name rendered in his own characters. Those are Unicode characters for Cherokee, that's kind of cool. For the Cherokee language, to create a written record for the Cherokee language, and he's pointing to his own syllabary. Daniel Webster does this to create the first dictionary of American English. Melville Dewey, God help us, did this for the entire human set of knowledge, and we all know how well that went. Henry Robert codifies the rules for running meetings, which we now call Robert's Rules of Order, because he's called upon, he's a civil engineer, he's a military engineer, wound up being the head of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 3 days before he retires. Everybody needs a pension. Robert is called on at one point to chair a meeting, and he doesn't know how to do it. And most of us would just get frustrated and kick something and bitch about it. He decides he will never be in that position again, so he writes down a set of rules, which is now a big fat book, which keeps the National Association of Parliamentarians in business. And just think about their meetings for 1 second. 1 second. So Sequoia and Webster and Dewey and Robert all provide order. They make order out of chaos, but one person's order. And they got there first. Some documents are intended to inspire. Here's the first document. This is not what you think it is. This has become Rosie the Riveter. This has become the picture of Rosie the Riveter that we all know. It's been adopted and co-opted and used in lots of different ways. This is not Rosie the Riveter. This is an in-house poster that was put up, you can just see it at the bottom, by the Westinghouse Company for their own workers during World War II. This is Rosie the Riveter. This is the song. So the poster is 1943 and was never seen in public until well after the war. The song is 1942, so this is the sheet music for the song. There was also a Saturday Evening Post cover by Norman Rockwell in late 1942 that was entitled Rosie the Riveter. And there was a real Rose who worked in a war production factory in Detroit, I think. So the song is based on her. The poster has nothing to do with Rosie the Riveter, but it has become that because that's what everybody thinks. Other unintentional other documents also become important in unintentional ways. Oh, wait, okay. Here's the random shameless iSchool plug that I was told I had to do. For the information school at the University of Washington, which, okay, they pay my checks, and half of you have been related to it at one point or another. And that was the best image I could grab, and I can hear Mike in the background, our Dean Emeritus, Mike Eisenberg. So this is the random shameless iSchool plug, and this was the best place I could think of to put it. Some documents become famous unintentionally. This is the Bible that Abraham Lincoln used at his first inaugural. Abraham Lincoln and his family had just moved from Illinois, and their books hadn't gotten there yet. So he was on his way to his inaugural, and they didn't have a Bible. So they had to run next door from the Capitol, across the street to the Supreme Court library. And the clerk of the Supreme Court opened up the Supreme Court library and provided the first Bible he could grab. This is a 1853 edition of the King James Version of the Bible, published in Oxford, in the UK. He just sort of grabbed it. Lincoln used it at his first inaugural. I have held this in my hands at the Library of Congress, in an extraordinary place, in the rare book room in the Library of Congress, with somebody looking at presidential memorabilia. And in the way that someone who handles presidential memorabilia in the rare books room at the Library of Congress can do. So here's Woodrow Wilson's Nobel Peace Prize medal, and here's a photograph, here's a drawing of James Madison and his first fiancée. Okay. Here's Lincoln's inaugural Bible. Here's John Wilkes Booth's wanted poster, which is the first wanted poster ever to feature a photograph. It was his publicity headshot. And in the hunt for John Wilkes Booth, they used his publicity headshot to make the wanted poster. Seeing that and the wanted poster next to each other was quite extraordinary. The beginning and the end of the whole saga of the Lincoln presidency. If this looks vaguely familiar to you from a few weeks ago, President Obama has used this at both of his inaugurals as well. Most documents are boring. They're mundane. You've got them with you right now. There are things that permit you to do things like driver's licenses, hunting licenses, firearms licenses, marriage licenses, green cards, checks, medical records, contracts, insurance policies, mortgages, leases, receipts. All of these things are meant to fulfill very specific purposes, and they've been designed and used over the decades and centuries to fulfill precisely those purposes. Often we hold on to them just in case you need it. You know, you hang on to that receipt from Nordstrom in case you have to return something. You hang on to the title to your car because someday you're going to have to produce it if you sell it or donate it. You have to have the insurance policy in case your house burns down, which means you shouldn't store your insurance policy in your house. Some of these fairly boring kinds of documents have become so ingrained that life has kind of grown around them. So the driver's license is your proof of age at the bar. It has nothing to do with driving, but it's the best document we have to prove age, so it becomes that. The passport has become kind of metaphorical. You know, passports were were designed to facilitate travel across borders. There was a period of time in the late 19th century when the passport system completely went out of fashion. Passports were not used in the late 19th, early 20th century because railroads were so fast that the passport system couldn't keep up with them. There was no mechanism by which passports in that great a number could be issued, so they just stopped using them. And they only came back in World War I to try to prevent espionage. But now the passport has become a metaphor. Your passport to adventure, your passport to a new life. And we use that word in ways that have nothing to do with passing through a port, which is where the word originates. Even something as simple as a utility bill, you can't think of anything more prosaic than that. This is often used to prove residency for someone who has just moved to a new area to establish, for example, to get a library card. Some documents are intended to standardize or streamline, to make something easier, to make something faster, more efficient. So all kinds of forms fall into this, and we all fill in forms. I filled in one. I signed a release form just an hour or so ago to be able to share the recording of this session. Some forms are a little more important, shall we say, or somewhat more fraught. This is an indulgence, and this is an indulgence that was printed by Johannes Gutenberg. You hear Gutenberg, you think Bible. Bibles are an expensive, time-consuming procedure. It took Gutenberg, who, by the way, was a terrible businessman, who produced a series of mirrors to sell at a Holy Year fair, and he got the year wrong. So he's stuck with a bunch of unsellable mirrors and has to invent printing using movable type to get himself out of a debt. So printing in Western Europe is basically plan B. And he prints Bibles because that's what you print, right? And it takes about 3 years and about 100,000 individual pieces of type. So those had to be cast and set and printed and inked and all the rest of it. It takes about 3 years to do that. But, you know, any good business plan, you can't just live for 3 years. So he prints indulgences. You see this is mostly boilerplate. This is just like going to the going to DOL to get your license. You can see little handwriting towards the end there. So that's name of sinner. I'm not kidding. That's how much you paid. That's who gave it to you. It's signed at the bottom. That's all boilerplate. You take that to your confessor in a state of grace. That I don't know how you do. I don't think I've ever been in one. And your sins are remitted. So that's a sweet deal. And up until this point, indulgences, of course, have to be written by hand. So this now streamlines the process of purgatorial expiation, no end. This is a great deal. Such a great deal that it becomes a fundraiser, kind of a raffle. And this is how increasingly, note the date, this is increasingly how the Catholic Church, the only church there was in those days, began to raise money for things like crusades, for things like the new St. Peter's. And it's only about 50 years later that 60 years later, that a certain German priest gets fed up with the whole indulgence system and buying indulgences, and he takes it into his head to tell his bishop how mad he is about this. And he does that by nailing a set of things to the wall that then somebody else takes and prints. And the 95 Theses become distributed throughout Germany, and the Protestant Reformation begins. Printing not only causes the Reformation twice, causes indulgences to be far easier to get, causes Luther to be able to spread his message much more widely. Luther becomes the first publicly recognizable figure in Western Europe.
O'clock.
At some point. Luther becomes the first publicly recognizable figure in Western Europe because his image is reproduced by printing. And so this kind of document, the Bible only comes 3 years later. The indulgence is 1452. The Bible was 1455. This is the document that makes Gutenberg a successful businessman. Just one more word on the Gutenberg Bible. Those are trophies for collectors. Even having a page is quite a feat for many repositories and collections. If there's any Canadians in the audience, there are no Gutenberg Bibles in Canada, and they're pretty steamed about it. To the extent, there's like 7 in Manhattan, the Morgan Library, New York Public, and whatever. And there's like a few scattered leaves throughout Canada, and they're kind of cranky. So don't bring it up when you go to Canada. Don't bring up the Gutenberg Bible. This is the dullest thing you will ever read. If you take it into your head to read this is the dullest damn thing you ever saw. This is the internet. This is the document, RFC 791, RFC Request for Commentary. This is RFC 791 from the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. This is the document that lays out how the internet works. All the mechanics and guts and packet switching and all the rest of it that makes the internet work. And just think about that for 1 second. It's a printed document that makes the internet work. Formatted to look like a printed document, and this is a digital thing, but it's formatted to look like print. And of course, this is the most streamlining thing that you've ever used. This is the Universal Product Code that's on now everything, on stuff at the grocery store and books and all kinds of products, giving way now fairly quickly to QR codes. The first UPC code that was scanned was in Troy, Ohio, 1974. It was juicy fruit gum, and it rang up at 67 cents. Don't say you didn't learn anything tonight. Some documents are meant to prevent things from happening or prohibit them. There is a riot act. So you know the expression, read the riot act to somebody. There is a riot act, and that's it. And it had to be read. This is 1714, so it had to be read. So here's an example of an oral document. Such things do exist. Think about testimony in court. Think about speeches. Yes, they're written down or transcribed, but those are basically oral documents, just like the Riot Act. Lots of laws fall into this category, including things like Supreme Court decisions. And as someone famously once says, the Supreme Court has no army. So why do we follow what the Supreme Court says? It's not like, Antonin Scalia is going to, well, he might come after you with a hammer. All right, I take that back. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not going to come after you with a gavel. Part of the reason that we follow what the Supreme Court says is just 2 centuries of tradition, but part of it is the way those documents are written. There's a whole regime around how those things are written and published and distributed and the way they look, and that has something to do with it as well. Some documents aren't necessarily made to confuse, but they do. And let's just spend a moment with Rosemary Woods. Those of us of a certain age remember Rosemary Woods. She was President Nixon's loyal secretary who is trying here to demonstrate how she might have put her foot on one pedal and reached over to grab the phone. This became known as the Rosemary stretch. Looks like kind of like yoga now. And that's how she accidentally erased, she said 4 minutes out of a conversation in the executive office in 1972. Nobody bought it. Nobody knows. The gap is not silence. It's just a bunch of really annoying buzzes, several buzzes, and you can hear them change. Yes, I did listen to the 18.5-minute gap. This is what I do for your edification, is listen to the 18.5-minute gap, which comes right as the president and John Ehrlichman are talking about the Democratic Convention that's coming up, and when it's over, Ehrlichman is talking about how much he liked the movie Hot Rock. Now, we all know that what's going on in that 18.5 minutes is when Elvis and the aliens appeared and their magnetic field threw off the tape. But the story is that it was just plugged into something. The story is nobody knows to this very day what caused, and people are still trying to figure out what caused the 18.5-minute gap. The forensic audio engineers who tried to figure out the 18.5-minute gap in the early 70s, what the work they did formed the technical standards for forensic audio engineering going forward. They literally wrote the textbook on how to detect what goes on a tape based on their investigation of the 18.5-minute gap. So it wasn't a total loss, which I suppose is somehow reassuring. Some documents are maybe intended to confuse, or it's just incredibly crummy design. This is the infamous butterfly ballot, which I am furious with myself for not having podcasted about last fall during the election. And you can see what happens. It's very easy to screw this up. And easy enough that in Palm Beach County, many people. So talk about a document that changed the world. Remember hanging chads? Yeah, hanging chads. Some documents are confusing, and it's a real darn shame. This is the Treaty of Waitangi. what many people refer to as the founding document of New Zealand. If you ask the British, this is the treaty that gave them sovereignty over New Zealand. And it's written down, and they all signed it. If you ask the Maori, this is the agreement that they made where the Maori ceded governance of their land to the British in return for protection. The Maori was a purely oral culture, so their version of the treaty is oral. The British version of the treaty is written, and to this very day, they are still figuring out what it is, because there are two incompatible and entirely different versions of the Treaty of Waitangi, to the extent that there is an entire governmental mechanism designed to arbitrate. Imagine our Supreme Court with two different documents that don't agree with each other. It's bad enough with one that mostly does. It's a mess. And two fundamentally different languages, cultures, and worldviews. It's quite stunning how turned around you can get by this. Some documents are for show. They're just for show. And the best example of one is one I can't show you. I have a list of 205 communists in the State Department. So said Joseph McCarthy. That list was never produced. That list was never seen. Later, the list had 57 people on it. It had 85 people on it. It had 10 people on it. Didn't matter. I can't show you a picture of it because there is no picture, because so far as we know, there never was a list. But it worked. And it worked because it was made to work. People believed it and were ready to believe it, and he made it work. And the lesson we learned from McCarthy's list is that somebody has to make it work. Documents on themselves can't do all the work. We have to help them, and they have to help us. Think of the golden disc. We'll never know, let's hope, we'll never know if anybody finds the golden record, but somebody has to help that to work. Some documents are meant to convince or persuade or argue a case. Any political manifesto falls in this category, so the Contract with America, 1994. Of course, your manifesto is my propaganda. This is a great film, if you've never seen it, Triumph of the Will. Propaganda, from the Latin, propaganda. Propaganda fide was the old office within the Catholic Church, the propagation of the faith. Propaganda means to propagate. This is a fantastic and quite frightening film made at the very dawn of the Nazi era in Germany. This is Leni Riefenstahl, who also directed Olympia and several other things. It's probably the best piece of propaganda you will ever see in your life. It's worth a watch. Don't watch it alone and don't watch it in the dark, but it's worth a watch. Bear in mind, when you think about things like this, that history belongs to the victors, not just because they write the history, but because they decide what to keep and what to preserve. He has nothing to do with this, he's just cute. But what he is holding, so just take a second. What he is holding, is the original book of minutes of the organization that became the Football Association in Great Britain. And that's the original rules of what's today called association football. We call it soccer. Soccer is a shortening of association. So what we call soccer is a sort of a crude formation of association football. The rest of the world calls it football. Association football is a particular kind of football. So is rugby football, so is rugby union, so is Canadian football, so is American football. And what distinguishes all of those, of course, is the rules. That's the original rules. What you see on the left-hand side of the larger image of the book there is the handwritten minutes by the secretary. And on the right-hand side, you see the printed rules. They had been printed a few days before they were adopted, and then they're just sort of pasted in the book. They started as the rules. Now they're referred to as the laws of the game, because that sounds bigger and grander. And notice they make him wear his gloves. That's not exactly the gloves one usually uses to hold archivally sensitive materials, but it's every time you see somebody handling this book, it's handled with great reverence, and it's the original minute book, and oh my God, these people go a little crazy about it. And it's 1863, so they're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the founding of association football. There are still people who are mad about the rules of association, still mad about it, not in a crazy way. They're furious about it because of the way it was done. One of the distinguishing characteristics because there were 20, 30 different games. Every school had its own version of football, and the rules were all different, so you couldn't play each other because you had to agree on the rules, and that took longer than the game. One of the real sticking points between different versions of football is whether you could kick people in the shins or not. And there's still people angry about the fact that got taken out. These are the same people who are worried about, not worried about concussions in the NFL and the NHL. Let them play, right? So they have long intellectual inheritors. The most disputed and contentious document, I would be willing to say, of all time is the Bible. No date to put on it, because there ain't no date to put on it. We believe the earliest manuscripts that represent what is today Old Testament texts go back, that'd be 3,500 years ago almost. That's a traditional date, which means we are guessing. And it's still being retranslated and repurposed today. The Bible, as we understand it today, is the result of a long series of centuries of political and historical and linguistic discussion and fighting. It was finally the Council of Trent in the 1450s that sort of settled out what the Catholic Bible was, but even that didn't take. And that's why there are books of the Apocrypha. So there's a Gospel of Mary that you've never read because it didn't make the cut. And there's a Gospel of Judas, and there's a Gospel of Jesus that are in the Apocrypha because somebody decided they weren't canonical. So this is an example of a document that everybody completely takes for granted, but can be quite different depending on which political pathway it took. There are some examples of things that are just out and out frauds. One of the best known examples of something that was completely phony was known as the Donation of Constantine. Doesn't that sound great? The Donation of Constantine. Probably written in the 8th century. The first reference we have to it was in the late 8th century, and then another reference in the 11th. What this alleges to be is a document produced by the Emperor Constantine who says, I have seen the light. And of course he did. It's hard for me not to see light right now. I have seen the light. I convert to Christianity. Christianity is right. I profess my faith. And Rome should be the center of the new faith. Completely made up. We don't know by who. It's not hard to guess in whose best interests it is to have Rome be the have the role of primacy in the church. It's not hard to figure out. This was exposed as a fraud in the early 15th century, but that's way too late. So that's why the Pope is about to no longer be in Rome. That Pope Benedict has a few hours left before he's whisked off by helicopter to Castel Gandolfo. And then we just heard today he's going to be the Pope Emeritus. Oh, can't they do better than that? I mean, I'm going to be emeritus someday. I mean, please God, can't they come up with some Pontifex bye-bye or something like that? I mean, you'd think they can do something better than that. So that's an example of an intentionally forged, an intentionally faked document. This is one of the better known contemporary. It's not a forgery and it's not a fraud, it's just phony. This is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's not forged because it is what it says it is, but it alleges to be the minutes of meetings for the Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. That's one of the less offensive images I could find. But you see a lot of this, snakes and spiders and scorpions and serpents and things like that with the charming facial features that you see. This document has been around for about 100 years. First of all, it's plagiarized from a bad French novel and a little-known play. kind of smashed together, and it reads like meeting minutes. It's just, I mean, as conspiracy documents go, it's kind of dull. And it goes on and on and on. I'll spare you the details of the whole thing. Henry Ford was a real fan. Henry Ford printed hundreds of thousands of copies of this. Printed it in his newspaper that he owned in Dearborn, Michigan, printed thousands of copies of the book itself. Still available for sale on Amazon. It's been published in almost every language. If you are of a mind to do it, search Twitter for Protocol Elders of Zion, and you'll get a whole bunch of people who will tell you just how authentic it is. It was exposed as a fraud in the 20s and 30s. Nobody cares. It was a result of a libel suit. Nobody cares. All kinds of detailed, analyses of all the things in there and how wrong they are. Nobody cares. You can't defeat a conspiracy with evidence, because that's not the point, because you have to believe the evidence. So, the conspiracy around the 18.5-minute gap, McCarthy, the Obama birth certificate, the butterfly ballot, the people who say that 9/11 never happened, the people who say that Newtown never happened. Not making that up. There are people who have gone through all the news coverage of Newtown and picked out the bits that were made up. So there was no massacre in Newtown. So often we think of documents as the final word, the what it is. But that's only true if you believe them. And there are people who just don't believe, and they don't want to. Some documents are hypothetical. There seems to be a source that underlies both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, but we don't know it. It's called the Q source, Q for the German Quelle, which means unknown. So this is a theoretical, hypothetical document. Not all hypothetical documents don't exist. This is the 19th Amendment. That is the entire 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and that's the original joint resolution of Congress, signed by the Speaker and lower down by the President pro tem of the Senate. One of the most fascinating things I have discovered, and if you're a listener of the podcast, you've heard this, in all of this research, is that there is no constitution. There's no single unitary constitution. If you go to Washington, if you go to the National Archives and the rotunda of the National Archives, you find the founding documents. You find the Bill of Rights, you find the Declaration of Independence, you find the original version of the Constitution. But that's all there is. Nobody at the National Archives, when an amendment gets passed, nobody pastes that in. Nobody edits the Word document and then makes a new PDF when it's over. The Constitution just happens. All the bits and pieces, this is in a Hollinger box somewhere in DC, no doubt buried deep underground at the National Archives. So are all the other amendments. The Bill of Rights got adopted before there was a process to adopt amendments. So they all just kind of did it whatever way they felt like. Every state sent in a letter to somebody and said, yeah, we ratified the Bill of Rights. Don't ask for the trail of evidence for the Bill of Rights. I don't think we want to know. It's not entirely convincing that it actually happened, but we'll take it as read at the moment. And there were 12, and 2 didn't make it. So what is now the First Amendment should have been the 3rd. Just FYI. One was about congressional pay. The other one is still out there. There's actually an amendment from the 1790s that's still alive, and some state ratified it a few years ago, became the 15th state. I'm like, you got nothing better to do? Anyway. The fact that there is no single unitary constitution, I've talked to people about this, it upsets them greatly. Doesn't the president have it? The president has no role in constitutional amending whatsoever. Several presidents have signed the amendments to make it look good, no role whatsoever. Doesn't the Supreme Court have it? The Supreme Court has no role in amending the Constitution. So the one that's sitting in a little pamphlet on John Roberts' desk is just as good as the one you could pull up on your iPad. There is no Constitution. And yet we can't agree what it means, but everybody knows what the words are, even though it's not all together. There's even documents that are imaginary. I'm a movie fan, in case you hadn't noticed. The letters of transit, this is the scene early in Casablanca where Peter Lorre's character is describing to Humphrey Bogart's character about, he's got the letters of transit, and which are supposedly signed by General de Gaulle. Why in the world would the Germans give a crap what General de Gaulle was saying in 1942? Makes no sense. But the first scene of the movie is about letters of transit, and the very last scene is Rick gives them to Ilsa. Sorry, I don't want to give away the ending of Casablanca. But I just did. Sorry, spoiler alert. Right. Spoiler is another great example of a kind of document, like people who intentionally spoil movies and stuff. Oh my God. I don't get that. That's just sickness. It's a sickness. So Rick gives the letters to Ilsa and Laszlo at the airport, and off they fly off of the wet runway in the Moroccan desert. I don't get that either. It's just weird. But there are no letters of transit. There's no such thing. The play, Everybody Comes to Rick's, that the screenplay is based on, it was made up for the play. Nobody seemed bothered by the fact that it doesn't exist. It's a MacGuffin. In Hitchcock language, it's a MacGuffin. It just sets the plot in motion. You can also buy letters of transit if you want to online. The other fictional document that I ran across not that long ago is there's a book that's quoted all the time in 1984, The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. You can buy that too, online. Beautifully bound in leather and stuff. It's actually quite, I knew I was going to do that. It's actually quite, it's dull as dishwater, but you can buy it. So there's one further category of document that we haven't talked about yet, and that's the podcast. So we're going to do a podcast right now. They're recording this, and this will go up live on the podcast site with all the others. And you're about to learn a dark secret about something you probably see all the time around here. So I'm going to try to do this as I would normally do it. I may run a line back or two because that's what I'm not used to doing this with people watching. This is usually me hunched over in my office at home trying not to spit on the microphone. So this one's going to sound really good. So here we go. Isn't it frustrating when you get a great idea, but you're just not in the right place for it? You know the drill. You're driving in the car, taking a walk, in the shower or in a bar, and it strikes the answer to world peace or the next great hit song or just the right words to finally break off a problematic relationship. But how to get it down? You reach for whatever's handy, furiously scribble something, and then you can relax, secure in the knowledge that your deathless prose or monumental design is now safe and preserved for the ages. Lots of ideas get no further than that. In the cold light of day, once the mojito has worn off or the steam from the shower has subsided, inspiration can often dissipate too. Now and then, though, a great idea, no matter how modest its beginnings, can survive and endure and even point the way to the future. A document that changed the world, a purported sketch of a structure that would eventually become the Space Needle, created by Edward Carlson, perhaps in Stuttgart, Germany, 1959. I'm Joe Janes of the University of Washington Information School, recording live at Town Hall in Seattle. I'm giving away a little bit with the word purported here, but not everything. There's more to this story and the story of the story than just that. The Space Needle is literally iconic for Seattle. Every conference and meeting here seemingly has the needle somehow as part of its logo. It's become what the Golden Gate Bridge is for San Francisco, the Gateway Arch for St. Louis, or palm trees and coke dealers for Miami. It forms the backdrop, the spine, if you will, for Sleepless in Seattle, taking the place of the Empire State Building and relocating an affair to remember. And it featured prominently for many years out the elegant high-rise window in Fraser, even if there's no place in town you could actually get that view from that angle. It doesn't take long living in Seattle before the story is heard how Edward Carlson, universally known as Eddie, civic leader, self-made man, president of Western Hotels, and chairman of the 1962 World's Fair Commission, travels to Europe in 1959, perhaps with friends picking up a car in Stuttgart. A local there tells him if he only has one night in town that he must eat in the TV tower that offers a spectacular view of the countryside. He's struck by the idea of it, a restaurant in the sky. And this is where the story starts to diverge. At breakfast the next morning, on a placemat, he doodles a picture of a spire with a flying saucer at the top. That's the story that he tells in his memoir and that is recounted in the official story of the fair. Or, at a souvenir stand, he picks up a postcard of the tower, scribbles a drawing on the other side, and sends it back to Seattle. Or he brings the postcard back with him. Or, as Carlson himself recounted in a 1981 interview, it's on a napkin. A story that gains ground after a television interview a few years later in which he helpfully redrew it. Although to me that looks much more like an elephant doing yoga than the Space Needle. This image is apparently the one most often found in histories of the event, including at Mohai. But no matter how detailed or colorful or entertaining the story, no original drawing has surfaced. The fact that there isn't a definitive version of this, that no museum or family member claims the original official sketch, doesn't seem to bother anybody. But the stories persist, largely because it feels like there ought to have been something. There's always a starting point for an idea or an innovation, and the cocktail napkin is a common and convenient trope, shorthand for the haphazard beginning of the creative process. The bolt from the blue, offhand, momentary, happenstance, when one reaches out to grab whatever's at hand. Stories are also told, as true today as they ever were, of other great notions that started unpretentiously. In 1957, Richard Berry hears a song he likes, goes to the men's room to grab what's available, and writes the lyrics to Louie Louie. Francis Scott Key, temporarily held by the British during the 1814 bombardment of Fort McHenry, composes the lyrics to what would become the Star-Spangled Banner on the only paper he has, the back of a letter. On his way to commemorate the Battle of Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln makes a few notes on the back of an envelope. And the perfectly aptly named Arthur Laffer, out for drinks with Donald Rumsfeld of an evening in 1974, draws a simple graph on, wait for it, a cocktail napkin under his wine glass, and the Laffer curve and trickle-down economics is unleashed on an unsuspecting world. Why do we sketch or jot or dash off ideas? And why are so many of those words so short? To have a record, or more precisely, to have something to record our ideas on, to give them tangible form, to have something to show, to demonstrate, to remember. This protects the idea, including legally, as intellectual property. You can't copyright an idea, but you can when it's on a placemat. And there are more than a few people who claim their share of credit for the needle's ultimate design. Doing that on the proverbial cocktail napkin adds to the mystique, the grand idea emerging from humble beginnings. Recording it also freezes it, gives it form and boundaries, and often a sense of incompleteness when you can't quite get it right, also a frequent companion in the creative process. You could also, for that matter, think of the needle itself as a document, a record of the aspirations and desires of that time, and of the process by which the people who imagined and carried out the World's Fair did what they did. Furthermore, it's part of Seattle's expression of itself, the kind of mid-century jet-set image that set the pattern for how the city and the region saw itself and came to be known. The theme of that fair was Century 21, and its proto-space age outlook inspired many, not least the design team of the Jetsons, who took the needle as inspiration for the sky-high apartment buildings. And then there's the story of the story. This is how myths, in the colloquial sense, get started, some simple act that over the decades becomes layered over with gauzy half-memory. Lincoln didn't write the Gettysburg Address on an envelope. Several drafts have been found, including one on official stationery. But it makes a terrific story. The great man drafting a few scattered notes to deliver one of the greatest, most eloquent statements in the English language, which he no doubt did, just not quite that way. So this is, perhaps, the story of a document that never existed, or more likely, one that's lost. At some point, though, there had to be something. No project that complex and involved could even remotely begin, let alone be completed, without plans and records of documents of all kinds, from drawings to budgets to schedules. The urge to get it down, to begin and to foster the process of creation by somehow recording your ideas, endures, whether that's on a cocktail napkin or a whiteboard or an iPad. Digital scribblings have their attractive qualities too. They're much easier to share and perhaps to manipulate and collaborate around, if less romantic. Given the modern proliferation and proximity to mobile information devices, the likelihood of being without a handy way to record the next great idea is pretty low. One wonders what the tablet version of a cocktail napkin would be. Actually, one doesn't have to wonder. Among the wide variety of sketching and doodling apps, there are several that use the napkin as a metaphor, proving once again that a good idea is a good idea, regardless of the medium. And that's that. You heard it here first. So, where are we? Well, I'm right there. That's me, roughly age 7 months with my mom and dad at my Uncle John and Aunt Irene's house. For most of human history, documents have been rare, unusual, special. Today, we live our lives from the moment of our birth to the moment of our death, and even a little bit before, and sometimes a little after, recorded, documented, kept. Increasingly, going forward, that accelerates. We're partially doing that to ourselves, recording our innermost, deepest thoughts on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and Tumblr. It's also being done to us with security cameras and credit card companies keeping our transactions and phone companies keeping our transactions and search engines tracking what you search. So it's much more likely today than ever before in human history that what you do, what we do, will be recorded. Yes, there are privacy concerns about that, and I think we've all heard that. But also, this begins to affect who we are as a society, who we are as people. If documents and documentation become the norm rather than the exception, two things might begin to happen. One, you get better documentation. You get more authentic, genuine records of what really happened because you have more sources of evidence that are more authentic and real. The other thing that happens is you begin to live your life differently. If you know that almost anything you do could be recorded, you might act and speak rather differently. Up until now, individual documents have changed the world. From this point on, billions of documents will change the world, and the idea of billions of documents will change the world too, for better and for worse, as we shall all discover. Thank you all very much. This has been great, and I look forward to hearing your questions.